Welcome to Radius of Reason. We have a bit of a different setup today to our 25 subscribers on YouTube. And 26 and our 2 Twitter followers, as well as what we always call out our 2 followers in Moscow and the Kremlin. Hello. Good day. My name is Andrey. I'm joined by co-host Levon. And today we're also joined by a special guest, Davis. Davis is a local, what did we say? He's a
local toilet philosopher.
This is a new approach we're taking for the show. We'd like to feature guests occasionally that are passionate about certain subjects, that have been taking the time to read about or learn about certain subjects. They might not be experts on it. Davis doesn't hold a PhD in philosophy or organizational psychology, but he's been taking a lot of time to understand something called complexity theory. And we felt that this was a valuable topic to introduce, given the fact that most episodes we've had thus far, up until episode 14, have loosely touched on this issue. We've talked about urban planning, we've talked about mobilization, and all of this kind of loosely skirts complexity theory. And we wanted to dive into it with somebody who is interested in it, passionate about it, but hasn't been warped by academia or professionalism. So that being said, Davis, welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us today.
Excited to be a local toilet philosopher.
Local toilet.
Strive for this time.
So what kind of toilets do you like to sit on?
Only the one.
Particular brand?
Only no, just whatever's at home.
And Bemis?
Never want it out.
Kohler? Or is it Cole? What is it?
I think it's Kohler.
Kohler.
Yeah, I think
high quality ones.
Sponsored by Kohler, yeah. So walk us through a little bit. Well, what drove you to complexity theory? Well, why is it something that you've been interested in?
Yeah, so originally I came across the idea or the theme. It was listening to some sort of business podcast. I think the guy at the time, or that particular podcast, he was a business consultant, and he had mentioned something about the Santa Fe Institute and kind of how they studied complexity and how it affects or how complexity applies to like businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I heard that at the time, I was just very interested in trying to figure out, I was just interested in learning more, truthfully. So I looked up the Santa Fe Institute, managed to find the first book, which is sitting right here. I forget the name of it. Complexity, the Emerging Science at the Edge of Order and Chaos. And so what this book outlines is just kind of how the Santa Fe Institute started, kind of how the study about complex systems grew, and how it spans, economics, physics, biology, chemistry, everything. And it kind of outlines each professor's contribution to the Institute at the time, and then kind of ends with, the book ends just with them continuing their studies going forward. And so that kind of inspired me after reading the book, which is very dense, by the way. After finally finishing it, I just found I really gravitated towards this idea of wanting just to learn more about what a complex system is, how it applies to my life, what I can learn from it. And so I've kind of spent more time just researching more and more about what a complex system is, trying to read more. I then bought this other book called Scale, which is one particular professor's application of complex systems or complexity theory into his own focus. And his is primarily biology, more from a biology perspective, and then he applies it to cities and companies. So, like I said, it just started off as like me wanting to learn more, and I've actually found myself really, really intrigued, and I find some sort of fulfillment by researching more and more into what a complex system is and how it applies to my life.
And what would you say is kind of the top thing that you learned from a practical standpoint?
From a practical standpoint, it gave me some sort of understanding of like why life is the way it is, why things happen the way they happen. For me, I've always had this kind of inherent belief in just balance, like things tend to balance out. Not sure why, but if you look around, like, everything's balanced, and that's why we exist, because there's an order of balance. And I think in one of the first books it mentioned, and kind of them trying to answer the question, well, like, there's chaos. Why does matter, or why do things gravitate towards order. And so they were trying to identify like, all right, well, things do gravitate towards order. So what are those rules that apply? And for me personally, that's, I don't know, just kind of understanding, you know, all right, well, why does the economy work the way it does? Why do we grow the way we grow? Why do we stop growing at a certain height? Why are humans tend to be, you know, more or less the same across the board? And then you have like elephants and all these different things that emerged from evolution, or however you want to do it. But why and how? So for me, I don't know why. It gave me more of like a spiritual, like, oh, okay, it gives a reason for it beyond just, you know, whatever reason. Why would it be religion or anything else?
What did it do to your understanding of free will? If just going straight for it. But
my understanding of
no, but let's say you've identified if complexity theory indeed is almost kind of common across living organisms, right? From us to elephants to the plankton at the bottom of the ocean. And if we operate under certain parameters that are common regardless of sentience or advancement in terms of thought or awareness, did it shape anything for you in terms of how you understand your own experience? I mean, did it do anything to reduce a feeling of being unique or free thinking to a certain extent?
That's a very deep question. I would say it did a couple things. So one, the understanding that the way consciousness or brain works is just a series of synapses or electrical signals that create me. However you define consciousness, you can talk about that all day. For my belief, I am a part of a system. It can be my familial system, my community system, my country system, the global system. I am a part or a small piece in that. There are things outside of my control that influence where I am, what I have access to, what my opportunities are. There's a way more stuff outside of my control than what I can control. In terms of my free will, even the way I take more time to understand how my brain works, because I don't believe I can't all of a sudden flip a switch and be like, all right, I'm going to be a doctoral candidate in physics. Like I can't. Like that's just not the way my brain works. Or like all of a sudden, like I'm going to be a night owl, sleep 3 hours a night, and just work, 24 or 21 hours a day, because that's what that adds up to. 21. Like I can't do that. So my brain is wired the way it is, and I can try and navigate through the framework that's created for it. My free will is just more or less how I approach it, my attitude towards it. I can't really do much else. I was blessed to be able to, be somewhat intelligent and be somewhat, free thinking, but there are constraints, and I've identified those constraints, and I just have to navigate through those and try and, like I said, at the end of the day, make myself the best possible. But at the end of the day, I am a part of a system. I'm influenced by that system. And it's just kind of how I decide to navigate through those points.
Very humble man. Somewhat intelligent.
Unlike us. Normally, these shows are just like ego baiting for the two of us.
I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the theory behind what you were reading on complexity. I tend to think about the world as almost a representation of like this mathematical substrate, right? Because you look at like parallel universe theory, and the reason why they're saying, okay, there could be an infinite number of parallel universes is because it's almost like reality is a manifestation of what's mathematically possible. In a sense, right? And so if like infinities are possible in mathematics, and maybe they're possible in the real world, or at least this is what the physicists kind of are forced into believing, because there's only so much that you can explore about our universe with our limited kind of tools at the moment. What does complexity theory have to say about its relationship to the more abstract realm of, say, mathematics? Do they speak about that? I know like fractals are kind of based on some sort of very basic but powerful equations, right? And I think they're differential equations, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe so, yeah. That sounds right. Yeah, fractals did come up in one of the books in terms of his explanation on how that applies. And like again, I'm no expert on this at all, but I didn't get as much from like the mathematical sense of like you mentioned parallel universe, stuff like that. The most mathematical piece was just this professor that was particularly, he studied computer science, and he was trying to figure out, basically it was an advent of coding and kind of, what the possibilities were, or what that limit was for computers. And so from a mathematical perspective, and I believe you can probably look it up, and you might have heard of it, the game of life. You heard about that?
That sounds familiar, but it doesn't.
It's basically what it was. He, and I'm going to really simplify this as much as possible. There was a board with a bunch of lights on it, and he created a mathematical equation or a system or an algorithm that basically said when one light's on, these certain lights can't turn on around that light, and just let it run. And what ended up happening is at first, some patterns evolved, and it was kind of simple of like, well, when this light blinks, then these ones can't, and then this one can blink. And after a while, everything came out of that algorithm. Like every pattern, not every pattern, obviously it didn't run for an infinite amount of time, but they found that it was just a perfect representation of how life constructed itself, just based on a very small set of rules. So that's the most mathematical thing I picked up from it, is just creation of algorithm and how it affected computers going forward. And just how, if you just make one little tiny set of rules, and however you want to define it, mathematics is well beyond my area of expertise, but however you want to define it, anything can be created from that. But I would highly recommend looking up.
But it's interesting, right, that you have these repeating patterns in the world, right? I mean, you see the structure of like kind of your veins, right? And then you look at a tree, and like it's the same underlying rules that are governing this behavior, right? And there is something to be said about that.
100%. I think there's in the book Scale, he actually specifically talks about veins and how blood flows through the body, and how each basically once each vein breaks off into another, kind of what that limit is in terms of, and I could not explain to you how like the mathematics behind flow work, but basically it's a similar structure between humans to us to like elephants, and how that same constraint applies to all of us. And I believe that he mentioned something about trees as well in terms of how water is distributed, but there is technically like a number or a limit to like, okay, blood can flow in a certain way, and the maximum, basically the way our veins are structured is about as efficient as it can get before, if it deviates even a little bit more in terms of like the degree, it wouldn't work. Or you might come across issues. But it is, like I said, they did identify as like similar across the board. It's really interesting. Like I said, finding just kind of commonalities.
I was reading the description of the Scale book on Amazon, and they mentioned the example of the longevity of like mammals, and how it's based on literally the size of the mammal. You can predict its longevity. And it was like, the relationship was like, if an animal is like twice as large, it lives 25% longer.
Yeah.
Right. Something along those lines. So it's just fascinating. Like, you have mammals, and they all kind of abide by
a logic.
This particular logic, right? And it's interesting. I mean, it's just crazy, right?
The wildest thing I read in it was that whole idea of like how size works. So the bigger an animal it gets, technically it needs 25% less resources than it did if it was smaller. But what they found is that the heart rate has a very big effect on the longevity, or is pretty constant on the longevity of a mammal. So small, like I think they said like a field mouse, its beats per minute is like, I don't know, call it 500 beats per minute. And you go all the way up to an elephant, it's like, call it 30 beats per minute. They will both ultimately have roughly around the same amount of heartbeats when they die. So call it 1 billion. There's a deviation of, I don't know, a bit, but just because of the rate at which the heart is beating, the field mouse only lived like 2 years, but will have had 1 billion heartbeats. Whereas that elephant would have lived like 75 years, but still have had 1 billion heartbeats. So they found that commonality between, it was ridiculous, from like the tiniest mammal all the way up to, I believe, a blue whale, is that similar pattern, similar structure. You still have that constant, but the beats per minute change, and that affects the life of the animal.
Is that why Donald Trump doesn't exercise? Is that why?
he can't get his heartbeats up. You only get a few heartbeats, man. It's limited. Now, are the conclusions around the discussions that you read around complexity theory, I mean, if it's even possible to draw a conclusion to this level, but is it fatalistic in a sense where are we prisoners of this order, or is it empowering in that, well, this gives us kind of a blueprint by which we can understand the world around us and how we form ecosystems to refine them and make them better? Or is it more like, well, it's useless because this theory is ultimately going to be governing every form of action and approach we take towards how we live our lives?
I found it more liberating, and I think in the book they even say like they're never gonna find like this is the rule that governs all of the universe. Like that isn't what they're able to find. But what they can just find is those common structures that kind of govern. For me, finding like, oh, okay, like one, I'm not gonna build a city, but finding like, oh, okay, like the bigger city is, the more innovation that happens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's liberating for me because now it helps it make sense. It's not random, and it's not. There's an element. I mean, in chaos, there's always going to be some element of randomness. Like I can't create. No person is ever going to be able to create just a complex system. Like, yes, I'm going to put all these pieces right here and build exactly what I want. But it's more like I'm going to put these pieces here and hope they should. You know, if I want to make this particular area of the community better, well, let's create more schools. Let's create more access to food. Let's make sure the water supply is good. Like you can put all these elements together to hopefully grow it and push it along in the right sense, rather than like this one policy is going to change this community for the positive, like fully. So for me, at least, it's like, okay, like it's not random. It's not always just random chance. There's an element of it, but you can influence it to an extent. So for me, it's liberating to know that like, okay, like I can have an influence in something. Rather than like, oh, I have to live within this framework, and I just, for me personally, I don't see it that way. Granted, like I said, I'm not building a city, but understanding that helps me to kind of.
It would be nice for politicians to be aware of these patterns, when they're making policy.
Yeah, that it's not just a one side, like, oh, this one thing will change it. Now, this is like one policy can help, I'm sure. But in the grand scheme of things, yeah. It's like,
in particular, to me, it's interesting because it's something like you see it. It's a pattern that repeats itself that can almost, in a scientific sense, be well established. Versus, you look at maybe some of the sociological research that's done. That's a lot more flaky, where it's very difficult to like really get at hard truths using the current methods that we have in the domain of sociology, for example, because it's just so, speaking of complexity, right? It's insanely complicated. But if you look at it in a different way, or if you're looking at kind of different structures or patterns, and there's some relation to mathematics, it seems like, okay, we can actually know something about these complex systems without trying to run these incredibly elaborate experiments or experiments that are in practice not possible, even again with the tools that we have.
I think to a certain extent it might also, not to keep on tying it back towards politics or economic development, urban planning, but I think we might have a level of explanation here as to maybe the failures of our political system in recent years to address needs of individual populations. Because all policy and politics seems to have escalated to the federal level, with things like social media over amplifying stories that sell, that drive clicks and revenue. And now all focus is on squabbles for the executive branch, elections for Senate or House of Representatives, as opposed to maybe a focus on issues that could immediately impact your community. So maybe an overabundance of narratives on federal policy and federal debate that doesn't necessarily have an immediate impact on a 50-mile radius around you, right? As opposed to, if we think about our community, things like potholes or water quality, that is immediately going to change our experience. And if maybe we took an approach of thinking about it in that sense, and then a similar approach was taken by our neighbors and the neighbors' neighbors, all of a sudden that complexity starts building up and you have a well-functioning, well-rounded ecosystem. But that's not really how I think our process of political thought and maybe drive towards policy is structured right now.
I know this is going to be a weird tangent, but in terms of like that whole argument of federal to local politics is like a huge issue right now. It's easier. I forget what I was listening to or reading, but you know, it's easier for one person to pay attention to the federal level because it's a spectacle. You know, everybody kind of knows what's going on. It's the president of the United States, this and that. Whereas, like, as you mentioned, honestly, what kind of affects your day-to-day life is what's happening, like local politics. But it's just not as fun to keep up with. It's not as attractive. You actually have to put in effort to figure out like who these people are. It's a whole thing, and the drive for people to pay attention to local politics needs to be a little bit higher, because that's ultimately what affects your day-to-day life.
It's kind of like the race to the top for attention, right? You're only focusing at the top of the pyramid, and I think we talked about this in the earlier episode, where from like an evolutionary standpoint, you know, like you want to focus on the leader of the tribe, you know, because the value in what he's saying is so much more immense than like someone who's like at your level, for example. But obviously now we're not living in tribes of 50 people. We're living in societies of millions of people. And so, you know, it's again, a mismatch of environments, and that leads to some of the political issues, I think, or at least one of many political issues. Now, I think when it comes to complexity theory, you said there's almost kind of this law that says things tend to get more and more complex. Did you allude to that, or what did the book say about that principle?
About how things get more complex?
Yeah. It's like inevitable.
Yeah.
I may have read it in the book description too, so I might be conflating. I might be conflating what you told me and like what I read.
No, you're good. I mean, I think I have two things to that. One is just as the world becomes more interconnected, there's the systems that are created are more complex. It just kind of as you alluded to, when you have a tribe of 50 people, is much different than now all of a sudden I can pay attention to everything that's going on in the entire world. So, I mean, you can look at how the internet has changed our perception of information. Like, we can learn anything at any time, whenever. So that introduces a
But
new
most
layer.
of us choose to just scroll through TikTok.
Yeah, scroll through TikTok.
Man.
It's easy. It's so much easier than having to disseminate all this information. So yeah, I mean, as the world has become more interconnected, especially with the advent of the internet, like things get more complicated, because now, like, okay, now I know what's happening in that corner of the world that I wouldn't have paid attention to before. So how does that affect me in my day-to-day? How does that affect my relationship with my own community or what I believe, or et cetera, because I see something else happening over there. So yeah, as time has gone on, as we get more access to information, as we become more interconnected, these systems change drastically. Even the size of our cities, it changes significantly. So, I mean, you had, I don't know, say 100 years ago, like New York City would have been one of the largest cities in the world. Now, Tokyo is a city of like 25 million people, which is by far like one of the largest ever in the history of mankind. So it's like, well, how do we deal with that? And now you have cities popping up in like China or India that are like consistently around like 10 million people like per city. It's like, okay, well, this is way bigger than before. We were traveling around. We had, oh yeah, there's a town of 100,000, there's a town of 1,000. Like, it's just changing the way it is. So the more people you get in one spot, the more complex it gets. And yeah, it didn't go too in depth. It's just like, yeah, as time goes on, things are getting more and more complex.
Now, would you guys say it's a more complex life now?
Yes.
I would disagree with it. I think life is simpler.
Okay.
My point being is I think that it's simpler in the sense that our immediate needs are met by outsourced function. So whereas maybe our time would be occupied by sourcing food, by procuring shelter, by secure, like protecting our food and shelter, all of that has been outsourced, right? So my immediate worry, and I think that's something we've discussed about in the past too, where our immediate worry is now kind of stray into the metaphysical, existential. We start talking about things like purpose or I guess maybe that is complicated to a certain extent, but there is very much kind of a introduction of leisure, for instance, which I think maybe is the antithesis of complexity, because I don't have to deal with all the variables of how am I going to grow my food? How am I going to chase down that deer in the forest? Where that has now been figured out, which has simplified maybe my existence to a certain extent.
But I guess what you're saying, in other words, is like life is... It's more simple in the sense that you don't have to do some of the tasks that are necessary for survival, but it's also, as you alluded to, less meaningful. We have more dull lives because now you have the introduction of things like bureaucracy, and I have to fill out a bunch of forms and things that are just like in the immediate moment. I mean, they serve a function obviously within the system, but in the immediate moment, it's like filling out a form. Like, that's not interesting. Right? And think about all the things you have to do. Change your oil. You have to go to the dentist. So your teeth don't look like shit, and they still might. And they might fuck up your teeth. Not speaking from experience, but you have all these like tasks that start to add up. And it's like, in some sense, it's more simple. In another sense, I mean, maybe you can make an argument for some things being more complex, right? Like you have to have car insurance. You have to call the insurance company to get it. You have to do X, Y, and Z. You have to make sure they're not charging you more and more every month. There's all these little things that take up more mental bandwidth, whereas in a certain qualitative sense, maybe you did have a simpler life if you lived in, say, a Native American tribe where, okay, my task for the day is to make sure my shelter's in good place. It probably is, right? Unless I'm a nomadic tribe. And then okay, we have to get food, but okay, we know we have to get food. Yeah, the task of getting the food might be complex in the sense that we need to know where the rabbits are. We need to know where the buffalo's going. But at a high level, it's kind of, in some sense, more simple. Whereas in life today, after college, you don't really have this kind of structure about your life. You don't have these goals that are necessarily laid out for you, whereas you would in these more ancestral environments.
I would argue that we actually have more structure, more goals now, because I think as we've advanced as a civilization, we've eliminated randomness.
No, I agree that we have more goals, but it's harder to know, you're not going to tackle all of them, right? But that creates an issue of how do you choose which goal? And trying to decide what career you want to really do. If you sit down and think about it, it's actually a very difficult task, right? So we do have the abundance of all these options, but it's not necessarily obvious that, I don't know. I don't know where I was getting with that.
Davis, what's your take?
No, it's for me nowadays, life is complicated. Like I said in the past, it's that whole hierarchy of needs things. Okay, I need to find something to eat, and I'm good, and I'm happy. That was it. Now that we have that fulfilled, now it's okay, well, now what do I do? I have this, and I think that's kind of a big thing in society now. There's this nihilistic attitude of we lack fulfillment. You think of everything that happened with work over the past 2 years, and people's I don't like what I do. I mean, that's the whole Great Resignation thing. This job was not for me, so I need to leave.
Would you say this is a product of complex societies? Is it inevitable?
I mean, yeah, it was kind of inevitable. As we got better at things, it had to kind of work out that way. I think, the more people you had in one area, the more people you had to do certain tasks. Obviously, you have economy of scale, so now you have food readily available, you have water readily available, and now you're just trying to figure out what your purpose is overall in this world. And so it's easier, it's not life or death, but you're dealing with fulfillment. What brings you purpose? What fills that void in your life? That's not that, how do I have meaning when I have all this here? And then you have to sort through all the information that's out there, like we mentioned with the internet. Okay, well, let me figure out something that's useful. Now, I can choose photography. I can be an artist. I can read books. I can paint. I can do anything possible. Then what do I do? I guess that's kind of the thing. If you don't have a framework, you're just kind of sitting there I can do anything. But what matters to myself? And trying to answer that question is where it gets tricky. And then you deal with all that.
So complexity theory would suggest that when we start introducing automation at scale, for instance, those sorts of questions will only increase tangentially, as they correlate with automation taking over things like, we're already seeing it right now with email drafting, for instance, right? We know there are computer programs that can slowly like eliminate that function at work, and it's only going to increase at scale. So then therefore we're going to have more of these more quote unquote complex existential questions we're trying to address, where, what is my purpose? If my purpose is not, with our current economic system, I think for at least the past century, purpose has largely been defined by economic output. And if you're no longer immediately producing an economic output, that's only going to start increasing these existential questions of, what is my existence really for?
Oh yeah, no, 1,000%. Like I said, I don't know what complexity theory says about that feeling. Other than that, yeah, as things get automated and start replacing jobs that people would have done otherwise, like
the vibes will be,
like, well, what do you do now? And as you mentioned, like, I'm not contributing to a system anymore. I'm just kind of here. And it's a problem that people are already having these days.
It's actually interesting to think about, with the introduction of AI and automation and robots, is it possible to, in some sense, say that we would be receding to a more simple system? I mean, it's complex in the sense that there are a few critical elements that are more complex, right? Like, how many people are going to know how to program an AI or the robots? But like, less and less people are going to really need to be exposed to that complexity, and more people will be kind of like just enjoying the fruits of that labor.
Well,
sitting there.
I think it depends on a lot of factors.
It depends on the political and economic situation that arises as a result. But, assuming a more of a utopian interpretation of things.
We're idealists here. I don't know if we managed to carry that across.
I don't know. I mean, to your point of like it becoming simpler, I think
for most people, like,
like on the surface it seems that way. It's like I have less choices to make, but I'll still always be sitting there like, well, what am I doing? It's kind of like that Wall-E movie.
Oh yeah,
you had all those people just sitting around, just kind of
chairs.
All right, well, we're here. And granted, I know the movie was about the robot himself, but ultimately it's kind of like, well, what do I do if everything's at my fingertips? And it's kind of there's a couple books you could probably, or things you could look up about people that have obscene amounts of money and didn't really create anything. They just kind of just do stuff. Like, it's not, they don't necessarily feel fulfilled. It's just kind of like, okay, well, or even think about like Olympic athletes.
Yeah.
That whole thing, like once they kind of hit the Olympics, win that gold medal, and then they're like, okay, well, now what?
Yeah, you turn into like I think Bill Burr referred to Lance Armstrong as like a sociopath on a a And
you're just sitting there like, well.
it's like if he like once he wins all the medals, he just starts doing crazy shit.
Yeah, and it's cool from like Olympic athletes, obviously like peak athlete, everything they need to do, and their dedication to that goal that they had is what drove them to that point. But as soon as you lose that goal, and in this case, like, well, now we don't have anything to do. As soon as you lose it, you're just like, well, crap. Like, what am I doing now? Like, I spent all my time and effort to get this thing. I got it. I feel great about it, but now what?
So if complexity is essentially the enemy of well-being and happiness and purpose, then is there a way? I mean, we talked about one possible way where complexity can be reduced, right? Like with the advent of AI.
By outsourcing complexity.
But let's say we deliberately try to just have a more simple life and go back to more ancestral conditions, because there are examples, and again, this is another thing that we've mentioned in a prior podcast, where you had colonists that were captured by Native American tribes and released in prisoner exchanges would eventually go back to the Native American tribes because they preferred that way of life, which was, in a sense, again, it's hard to define these words like simple, complex. What are you really referring to? But in some sense, it was a more simple life, and they preferred that. And there's even cases, I think, of Amazonian tribes today where people have returned to these tribes. And so is there something that we can do today deliberately to reduce the level of complexity, even if it's not as dramatic as, living in a hunter-gatherer-esque society?
We all become Amish, ultimately.
Yeah.
Amish societies are a good example.
Yeah.
But is there a way to still live in like the modern world and have a more simple life? Living on a farm? I don't know.
I guess, you think about every like self-help and all these things, like this idea of like meditate, like taking time to actually step back from the hustle and bustle of what happens and all these things that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis of, you know, your job and what you're gonna do next, all these things, like just taking time to actually sit and be like, okay, it's cool. The time we live in now, there's so much going on, so much information that we have to somehow process across our own community. Like I mentioned earlier, like we can see what's happening in the world. Like, how do I deal? Like, what does that do to me mentally? Like, I see a war happening somewhere else I'm not even at. Like, okay, well, how do I process that in my brain? So, like I said, we're bombarded with information, and honestly, just taking the time to the point of like people going back to like starting a farm. It's like, it's simple, it's easy. I just have to maintain this little plot of land. I need to grow something. Nature's going to do what it does. I just have to deal with that and nothing else that's happening 3,000 miles away.
And then you start to think, where am I going to take a shit? You know, how is this taken care of?
Exactly. But then you just do it and you're like, yeah, that's fine. You know, it's not super like existential or like needing that. So yeah, this whole idea of like just taking a step back to, we are in a very complicated time and trying to take it like one is feeling that we don't have to deal with everything all at once. And two, taking the time to step back of like, okay, like I need time to think and just live a simple life.
Is there anything in what you read, was there any discussion around extinction events and maybe how that impacts evolution or the development of communities? Yeah,
they did mention something about this, and I wish I could define it better. This finite singularity or something like that. No. Basically
sounds legit.
Yeah, sick. I would have to look up the actual definition of it, but this idea of that, like, particularly with innovation, as society evolves, the rate of innovation gets faster and faster over time, and so we innovate with the idea that there's infinite resources. Yeah. That is not true. So basically what he's saying is like, well, with every innovation, so if we were to stick on one path of like, let's say we stuck with coal for as long as we just never did use anything else to coal. Yeah. Just did it. At some point we would peak, it burn out, we'd fall apart. And then luckily we moved on to something else. We moved on to oil, and we're still kind of more or less on that phase. But basically saying as time moves on and as societies evolve, that rate of innovation actually has to increase. And you can look at that rate of innovation has to increase before it falls apart. And that's what that singularity is. You just have to kind of, if you stay on that trajectory of whatever that resource is that you made, you just have to like shift it to something else. So take oil, for example. If we just stuck with that and did nothing else, we would eventually hit that singularity, fall apart. But what we're doing now is we're innovating, and now solar. And then we're trying to go that route. But the thing is, your rate of innovation has to happen faster and faster every single time. And I think the example he used was, if you looked at, I want to say it was either computers or phones, the rate of innovation over the past 50 years has been just ridiculous. Yeah. You take the computer that sent the man to the moon is super, super, super simple. You could do that with almost whatever level of calculations it had done, you could basically do it from your phone now. And so just how quickly that's happened, and what is that next thing going to be? Now phones it's a different thing per se, but it's just that rate of innovation. You just have to shift into a different I can't think of the right word for it. You just have to shift into a different thing before you kind of reach that peak and fall apart. And they've identified it, or he identified quite a few in societies in the past, all the way back to pre, what's the thing? Is it the industrial revolution? So before that, just kind of that rate.
That's interesting to think about. I was just thinking of something like energy, where you have to continually innovate to.
Oh, that's the big, yeah.
And I was thinking, if you could harness the power of fusion or fission, whichever one it is, and essentially have an unlimited supply, or you get solar panels to the point where it's 100% efficiency, right? I'm just speaking out of my ass here, but eventually maybe you'll plateau for a second, but then you might be creating devices that need to consume more and more energy.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, maybe you're running these virtual simulations of reality itself, or you've created an Earth yourself. How much power is that going to take? And then all of a sudden the sun is actually not providing enough energy to fuel people's smartphones in the year like 3500, right? Like, so there is always like, that law seems to make a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that's the point. It's like, well, you're limited by whatever in terms of energy output. You're limited by what that resource is. And as soon as you make a new one, it's fantastic, but you're going to push it to its absolute limit before you all of a sudden need to find another one. So even like you said with solar, like, okay, we can harness energy or something, but if we're doing that, we're going to use every amount of it. We're going to keep pushing it until we cannot use it and we have to ship something.
And I think that's the interesting thing about these complex systems is like they kind of work off each other. It's kind of like an arms race where even in evolution, like an example is like a cheetah's speed and like a gazelle's speed. Like the faster
pretty fast
a cheetah gets and the more successful it is at hunting gazelles, which is like the fastest gazelles to reproduce more, and then like you have more variation in that sense. And
which also I think it introduces an interesting concept around there is never any like our civilization's experience is never one of like standing still. Right. We and as we advance, the innovation becomes a little bit more exponential, as we've discussed. But I think about this a lot in terms of the question of like world peace, for instance, or as a concept. I mean, it's amazing, right? Like denuclearization, like demilitarization. Everybody lays down their weapons. We figure out how to live as a collective civilization. We focus on the sciences and whatnot. But then at some point, you start realizing where that might not be possible because of this notion of we constantly have to be in motion as a species, and motion kind of creates conflict to a certain extent because it creates dissatisfaction. So then you start getting into a deeper thought process of, are things like world peace even possible if indeed we have nothing that is going to allow us to stand still for a long period of time? And then as a sub-concept to that, it's also a question of, is this reality we're describing simply a product of a certain economic system that we've embraced and evolved in accordance to, historically speaking, or if we indeed did kind of transition over to a different economic model, would we be able to kind of stem the flow of development and evolution for development's sake, so to speak, if that makes sense?
No, I think this, particularly in your first point of like the whole concept of world peace, like we always have to, like you mentioned, we have to be in a state of motion. Nobody, I mean, it's just the way humanity is. We'll always find a reason to like hate someone else or find, like you mentioned, find friction. In my mind, like the only way to unify people is to have an external conflict.
Aliens.
And I know it sounds weird, but that's typically, I mean, you can look at, even if you look at like just smaller societies and like war and stuff like that, like if you're fighting against something else, that thing will be more tightly wound. And to do it across a globe, it has to be something external. And it has to be something physical. It can't be, it's abstract concepts. People will perceive it the way they want to. It has to be like, I'm not saying aliens have to do all that stuff. I'm not trying to go that far, but basically, in your point of
just fight bad vibes, man.
Yeah, we can't just fight vibes all the time. But in your point of like an economic model of a shift in whatever it might be, I mean, the conflict that it would cause would be intense. But like I said, it would unify certain parts here and there. But yeah, we could never just be in world peace just with ourselves. I don't believe so. It'd be nice. It's a fun thought. But it's like, yeah, we just can't. We'll always find something. We'll always look at that person that has more. We'll always look at the person that has less. We'll always look at the person that has the same and wonder, well, I can do more, so let me figure out how to get there, regardless of, there's always people like that.
But I guess the question is, if our evolution and kind of embrace of the exponential increase of complexity, right now it seems, at least in this country, a lot of that is done for the sake of, let's say, profit, right? We are driving forward. We are moving forward because we are generating profit. And if we introduced a different economic model where, let's say, we were evolving for the sake of humanity, right? We were evolving for the sake of, why, if you look at the funding of sciences in the United States, I believe a lot of it comes from the private sector, right? Because the private sector is trying to innovate, and I may be totally wrong. I just made that up. But my feeling is that private sector drives research because research is going to stimulate, things like product development, which is going to make you more competitive against, another company on the market. But if we looked at it from a standpoint of, well, we're going to evolve and create a cure for cancer, for instance, because that is what we need for humanity to advance, would that kind of slow and maybe change the nature by which complexity enters our lives?
You would think it would have an impact. I don't know whether it would completely undermine what he was saying in terms of inevitably having these conflicts, because you're still moving in some direction, even though it's not a direction like that capitalism as it is set up currently in the U.S. enforces or amplifies kind of like the more conflicted direction that we're heading. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, is that kind of what you're saying? Can you change the incentive so you're not moving towards a more perilous future?
Yeah, I mean, you always have to innovate for something, whether it be profit, whether it be protection, or like defense, for example. There always has to be a reason to innovate. And if you can, right now, you're right. We innovate for profit. Well, the richest company on earth is Apple, right?
Probably.
I'm pretty sure because they hit the trillion dollar market cap mark.
What?
So I think last year or something. It was ridiculous.
Most profitable company on earth is this podcast.
But right now we innovate for profit. I'm sure it could shift.
It could buy us time. As we get more and more intelligent, maybe we can find a way to limit the conflicts that are naturally going to emerge from the pace of innovation and all these other factors that accompany life, right? That's the only thing I would say. But to also go back to your earlier point about, kind of the, it just escapes me right now. We have to continue to innovate because we're going to run out of, say, certain resources, right? And you look at capitalism and this model of infinite growth, which is blatantly unsustainable. I mean, we have to, something has to be done about that, right?
Yeah, no. And like I said, I think capitalism just really, I think at the end of the day, no matter how far back in history you go, like people will always want to grow. Like growth is inherent. Any village, any society, like they will try and optimize and be as efficient as possible and innovate with, if I have a farm, how do I make this farm the best possible? And once I get that the best possible, I make another farm. I think that's true in just human nature of always wanting something more. I think capitalism just kind of took that and just like, all right, well, we're going to do that and apply it to everything. And profits what drive that spur of innovation.
So would you say then that regulation against some of these things in a capitalistic system is sort of best case? It's just kind of like a temporary barrier, and it's eventually the dam's going to eventually burst anyway.
It's an interesting thought. I don't know. I mean, regulation's always useful, but then you're always going to want to have. There's someone that's always going to want to break whatever regulation that is. No matter if it's good, bad, someone somewhere is going to want to break it. And it's just, I feel like it just becomes a dance of like, this particular segment of society is going to continue to innovate. We're going to regulate it. And you're just constantly kind of in this motion of trying to basically balance each other out. I don't think anyone,
this makes me think of something that's sort of related to what you're saying, but a bit of a tangent. But as things continue to get more and more complex, like our political systems are not able to, like, think about things that are being innovated. Like our political systems aren't being innovated, yet society is becoming, exponentially more complex. We're trying to govern exponentially more complex societies with essentially like Stone Age level political systems, right? So like,
no, that's very true.
So, I mean, it seems doomed to fail. Like what I would say is you can't rely on a system, right? Because a more complex system is going to have even more and more bureaucracy. If you think it's bad now, if you think about all the forms that you have to fill out, and government is bad now, imagine something that is actually corresponding to the level of like complexity we actually have in society, right? I think what you need, you need a new way of thinking almost, but I would say first and foremost, you can never develop a political system or even an economic system that is going to be perfect or address all the details correctly. I think you have to invest in each human being that is a part of that system. And the more robust you can make the people, then the less perfect the system of governance has to be. That would be like how I would approach it. But that's also difficult. Then it's almost like a circular problem, because then like to get to those robust people, you need a system of governance that like prioritizes education, which, on its face seems doable, but in the US that seems to be like not entirely doable for some reason.
No, like I said, I think, and it comes down to like, we always want one particular answer. I don't think there is, this system will work indefinitely. Like I mentioned earlier, it's always going to be a dance of like, it works now, we'll have to change it. As long, for me, there's a couple things here. To your point, yes, our political system is freaking old. It's every society is complex now. It needs to change. We have 2 parties. Like what? Like how do we have 2 parties for the entire, all of our that we base all of our decisions on? I think the perfect system is the one that adapts and that can kind of flow with what's happening, rather than like, this model will work indefinitely. Like that's just not gonna happen.
Look, all I'm saying is Afghanistan has existed for centuries.
That is true. It has existed.
The notion of Afghanistan has been there. They have outlived every empire.
But what you're essentially saying is writing down rules on stone tablets and like that fixed system is just not.
No,
it's not sustainable.
It's cool for a while, and like I said, everything will work for a bit. But like I said, like I said, everything needs to evolve with everything else. And as you mentioned earlier, we're complex. Like we're a global economy, global politics. Everything is just so interconnected, and yet 2 parties. That's what you guys get to vote on. England has like 4.
Well, it's funny. No, it's another point. It's like we have this incredibly complex society, and we have 2 parties.
Yeah, no.
We have binary choices.
Yeah, but 2 binary choices.
Completely insane. Right?
I think there's also a level of.
In a tribe of 50 people, you might have had 3 options. You know what I mean?
That's the percentage-wise. That's great.
Yeah. I think there is a level of hubris that might come with the thought that we ourselves, maybe as a country or a civilization, are not going to become victims of like the scaling complexity. We talked about Native Americans earlier, and that's definitely a civilization that was crushed ruthlessly by just the tide of development. And one group of motherfuckers figured out how to like use gunpowder to shoot guns, and all of a sudden they're running all over the world, making life difficult for everybody. But there is this thought of like, I think a lot about there's a journalist and author named Charles Bowden who exclusively wrote on Arizona, and his big thesis was like Arizona, what we understand as Arizona now is essentially just a testament to failed civilizations, because it's layers of bone and debris and like spearheads, and it's different people come in and they try to build up their towns and empires in Arizona, and they all fail because Arizona, ultimately speaking, is not hospitable to long-standing human life. And here, and he's always like we, and he wrote like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, he's like, we think that we are the ones that are going to conquer that, but it's just not going to happen. And I think that's kind of a greater thesis maybe around this notion that we are going to be the civilization, the country, maybe the polity that's going to weather the tide of increased complexity, and we're going to come out on the other side of it, in our current shape, in our current form, in our current 2-party system, if you will. But it very well may be that we ourselves will not be the top dogs that emerge out of maybe the exponential drift of history and economics, and so to speak. Does that make sense? It's kind of space brainy, but
no, I think that's the fear now. It's like, we're not going to weather the storm. But my thing about this kind of, and I can't speak for why civilizations fail. There's a whole book on that, actually.
What?
I think it's the name of the book.
They wrote a book about it.
It's called Disaster, I believe. But it's this idea, like, everybody wants to hold on to that framework or that system so tightly that, yeah, eventually, like I mentioned, nothing works and nothing sustains in perpetuity. Like, it will break. Yeah, you might be top. I feel like it's better to last long than last a short amount of time at the top. It's like, yeah, okay, like I might not be able to sustain this overall, and yeah, we might have to shift and change some things, but at least we can last longer than if, like, yeah, fuck it, we're buckling down, we're gonna fight the tide of life, or the tide of whatever changes there are. We're gonna fight it tooth and nail.
But we're not. But you know, we're not designed that way, because it's kind of like the principle of, if you're not first, you're dead. you know, because if you're not on the top, you leave yourself vulnerable. So there's this massive incentive for all parties to try to get to the top and be the top dog, right? And that, I mean, that poses a lot of the conflicts that we see in the world today. Yeah. Right?
Which brings back the original point that there is a need for an external enemy or a force as like a unifying and a rallying factor for everybody. So indeed, people say it as a joke, but yeah, if aliens came, we had to fight them.
Unify so quickly.
But we'd be exterminated quickly too, if we're being honest.
Too, yeah. But we would be the most unified we've ever been as a globe. We're like, hey.
Yeah.
The first 100 days will be a nice reality show for the aliens. They're like, they think they have a chance. And then...
Yeah. Oh, it's funny. But no, I think, you just have to be adaptable. And to your point of, like, we do have this inherent belief that we have to, if you're not first, you're dead. Like I said, I would want to look more into that and see how true it is, because, like, I feel like the more you can adapt to a situation, regardless of your first, as long as you don't die, the more you can adapt to the situation, the longer you can.
No, I agree with you. I think that's.
But the way we think is that way.
Yeah.
For sure.
No, I agree. I think we should try to aim for that, for a more sustainable, like, approach. But again, it's just, I mean, it's good luck convincing people.
Yeah. To, like,
of that.
You're fine. Like, you don't have to fight your way up all the time. Like, you'll be good. You'll come out on top eventually. Right. But yeah, no, it's an interesting thought.
Let's end capitalism.
Oh God!
Here we go.
Wait a second now.
You're with it now.
Shit.
That's gonna come up on a job interview. Unless capitalism saves
the day.
Saves humanity.
Well, there's also the argument that you need more innovation to grapple with the downsides of the current level of innovation that we have, and maybe the only way
is for a capitalistic system to kind of drive.
For a capitalistic system to survive is to be even more capitalistic, in a sense.
I mean, to a certain extent, I think electrical vehicles, and they have their problems, right? The lithium batteries are just as, like, destructive to the environment, like, in their production process. However, the push towards removing oil dependency in our transportation networks isn't happening. Well, there is government incentive to it, but it's largely driven by the market to a certain extent. We have all, you have Tesla, you have Rivian emerging as a potential competitor, because Amazon's buying their electrical fleet of delivery vans and whatnot. That's all kind of happening in a largely independent ecosystem, again with incentives from the government for tax breaks and whatnot. But maybe that is how it works out, right? Maybe capitalism's going to come through at the end of the day.
Well, yeah, it's difficult to assess when you're kind of, like, in the moment, but and maybe in hindsight we'll see, like, okay, capitalism was actually, like, the absolute greatest system because there was a bit of a bit of trouble, early on.
We had some quirks.
We almost, destroyed the entire climate and everything and absolutely polluted the earth, but eventually it's led to these, like, unbelievably innovative technologies that have reversed climate change. They've cleaned up the earth of all the microplastics, and we're living in an absolute tech utopia.
They cleaned up all the shit they caused. It's like talking to, like, hardcore communists. It's like, look, yeah, like Stalin and Mao, they killed hundreds of millions of people, but
no, capitalism definitely has a good. The rate of change, or, like, the rate of innovation is just obscene because you have competition, and that drove it. I mean, really quickly, which has been a benefit. I mean, although the internet has its negatives for sure. Like, the connectedness it's given us has been like, wow, would you look at that? Because there would have been no reason to do that. Even the whole thing about the space race back in the 50s, like, Granted, I wouldn't say it was capitalism more so.
That was competition with communism.
Competition with communism. But the amount of innovation it drove just from that is like, oh, wow, okay. So it did speed things up.
I think it's I think it's still up in the air, though, to say whether it's been like a net positive or negative.
Oh, yeah, true. We'll probably be dead by the time. We'll never know.
That kind of brings it also is that we, ultimately speaking, if complexity is exponential, but we're also experiencing it in a tiny little sliver of experience that we're going to see in our, I hope both of you live very long, fulfilled lives, but 70 to 80, 85 years. We're not going to see the full tide of things. So in a certain extent, our experience is limited, and we're experiencing complexity within a small sliver of a greater path of development. And somebody eventually will sit down and be like, yes, like 200 years of this, right? And it's going to be meaningless to us, but somebody's going to study this and look at it from a standpoint of were these incremental changes we are making actually effective or not effective in the greater tide of how things
That
evolve.
would be fascinating for sure.
I mean, just like we're doing now, like we're looking in the past to see like, oh yeah, like Industrial Revolution really sped things up, didn't it? Yeah. Prohibition didn't work, but like, just analyzing all these things that happened. Is okay.
Some dude lived his entire life, probably couldn't get a beer.
I know. Oh, dang. That's kind of sad.
Rest in peace.
All right. We are right on the hour mark. So I think we have covered every topic under the umbrella.
Davis, do you have any closing thoughts? Do you have anything that you want to leave us with?
Oh, man. Something profound.
Something profound. If you can get more deep than we have no free will and whatnot.
I'll say not an expert by any means. But just exploring the topic of a complex system, or why things happen the way they do, why things develop the way they do, has given me a sense of like understanding of how life should be lived going forward. I'll never know all the answers, and as you said earlier, like we won't know the outcome of the decisions made today in 100 years. But always striving to know that even though I might be a small part of the cog, I'm still an important part. And even though there's a lot of things that are outside of my control, I can still influence my day-to-day with the people I interact with the people, I come across. And like I said, who knows? That one person I say hi to, based on what complexity theory, that whole butterfly effect, now everything's tied together, that person might go on to do something further. So, like I mentioned, although things are outside of our control, there's still stuff you can do day to day.
Small pieces, man.
But ultimately, we don't know. We don't know shit.
True.
Toilet philosopher says we don't know shit.
Don't know anything. No.
Well, I think we need to define toilet philosophy. Amateur philosophy, right?
Yeah, we'll never know anything, or never know everything. But yeah.
Well said. Well said. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for listening to Radius of Reason. We'll be back again soon.
Thanks for joining us, Davis.
Appreciate it.
Adios.
Goodbye.